Most gardeners make one critical mistake that quietly destroys their soil over time. They treat worms like something that shows up naturally instead of something you actively engineer into your system. The consequence is predictable. Soil becomes compacted, microbial life collapses, and you end up relying on fertilizers that give short-term growth but long-term dependency. You don't build a living system, you build a feeding cycle that never stabilizes. This is where the so-called $2 pipe trick completely changes everything. It looks too simple to matter, which is exactly why most people dismiss it. But in real garden conditions, raised beds, backyard plots, even container systems, it becomes one of the most reliable ways to multiply worm activity exactly where you need it. And once you understand how it works, you stop asking how to add worms and start designing systems that generate them continuously. Before we go deeper, I want to pause for something important. There are small dog rescue organizations doing life-saving work every single day, pulling abandoned and injured dogs off the streets, feeding them, treating infections, and giving them a second chance at life. Most of them operate entirely on donations, often struggling just to cover basic food and medication. If you're finding value in this kind of practical gardening knowledge and you feel even slightly moved by the idea of helping, consider supporting a dog rescue in any way you can. Even a small contribution genuinely changes whether a dog survives or not. It's one of those quiet impacts that matters more than people realize, and it keeps these organizations alive when they have no other funding source. Now back to the garden, because this is where things start to get interesting. The $2 pipe trick works because it doesn't try to buy worms or culture them in a separate bin. It creates habitat pressure that forces worms to colonize your soil naturally. You take a simple section of PVC pipe, usually around 2 to 3 inches in diameter and about 12 to 18 inches long, and you drill holes along the sides, not randomly but in a staggered pattern every couple of inches. Then you bury it vertically in your garden bed so that only a small section remains above soil level. Into that pipe, you consistently add organic matter like vegetable scraps, crushed eggshells, and a bit of moist cardboard. What happens next is not theory, it's biology. Worms follow food gradients, They move toward decomposition zones. That pipe becomes a concentrated feeding chamber, and over time it turns into a breeding hotspot. In raised beds especially, I've seen worm populations double within just a few weeks, simply because the pipe creates a stable, moist, protected microenvironment. Now, here's where experience matters. You can do this with a bare pipe, but if you want it to actually scale into something powerful, you integrate it with a proper worm production system. This is where the VermiHut 5-tray worm composting bin comes in. I'll link it in the description below. I've tested this system alongside in-ground pipe setups, and the combination is what turns occasional worms into a consistent soil factory. The reason it works so well is that the bin gives you controlled breeding capacity, while the pipe trick distributes those worms into the garden where they actually do the work. Most people make the mistake of thinking worm farming is either indoor or outdoor. In reality, the most productive systems are hybrid systems. You breed in a controlled environment, then distribute into active soil zones using structures like the pipe. By the time you've been running this setup for a few weeks, something interesting starts happening. You stop seeing dry, dead patches in your soil. Water retention improves noticeably. Even after irrigation, the soil holds structure instead of collapsing into dust or mud. That's the biological signature of worm activity. The mistake I see beginners make is overfeeding the pipe too quickly. They treat it like a garbage chute. That's wrong. You want slow, steady decomposition. About a handful of organic waste every 2 to 3 days per pipe is enough in a standard raised bed. Any more than that and you create anaerobic conditions which actually repel worms instead of attracting them. In hydroponic adjacent systems like deep organic media beds or hybrid soil cocoa mixes, This pipe trick still works, but differently. You don't rely on it for nutrient breakdown as much as you rely on it for microbial seeding. Worms carry bacteria, fungi, and enzymes that colonize surrounding media. Even in systems that are technically soilless, the biological spillover effect is real. Now let's talk about why this idea was ever forgotten in the first place. The uncomfortable truth is that modern agriculture has spent decades trying to simplify soil into a chemical equation. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, those are easy to sell, easy to measure, and easy to repeat. But worms don't fit into a product cycle. You can't bottle a living soil ecosystem and sell it in a spray can. So instead of encouraging systems that build soil biology, the industry leaned heavily toward inputs that bypass it. That's not a conspiracy theory. It's just economics. A living soil system like the one you build with pipe tricks and worm farms doesn't create repeat dependency. Once it stabilizes, it reduces input demand. That is the exact opposite of how most commercial agricultural products are structured. The VermiHut system becomes especially powerful in this context because it allows you to scale worms without constantly buying inputs. You feed kitchen scraps, garden waste, and cardboard, and in return you generate castings that completely change your soil texture. When you connect that output back into your pipe system, you are essentially closing the loop. Nothing leaves your garden unless you choose it to. I've used setups like this in small backyard gardens where space was limited to just a few square meters. Even there, a single pipe combined with a worm bin transformed soil that was previously compacted clay into something soft, dark, and full of structure within a season. In larger raised bed systems, multiple pipes spaced every meter create a distributed biological network. It's not just composting, it's soil engineering. One thing I always tell people is this: if your soil depends on you to be perfect, it will fail. But if your soil is full of life that can adapt, break down material, and self-regulate moisture, then your job becomes maintenance instead of rescue. Worm systems like this shift you from gardener to ecosystem manager. Over time, you'll notice something else that most people don't expect. Pest pressure drops, not because you're spraying anything, but because healthier soil grows stronger plants, and stronger plants don't signal distress in the same way weak, chemically pushed plants do. The entire garden becomes more stable. So the pipe itself will eventually become a biological artifact. If you pull one out after several months, you'll often find it coated in castings and microbial films. At that point, it's no longer just a feeding tube, it's actually become part of the soil structure. If you're serious about scaling this system, that's where the VermiHut 5-tray worm composting bin really proves its value again. You can expand worm populations during the warm seasons, then redistribute them through your pipe network when conditions are optimal. It becomes a seasonal rhythm: breed, distribute, stabilize, repeat. The final mistake I see far too often is impatience. People expect immediate transformation, but soil biology doesn't respond to urgency. It responds to consistency. Give it time and the system compounds. A single pipe becomes multiple worm zones, a single bin becomes a breeding engine, and suddenly your garden is no longer dependent on external fertilizers. What you're really building here is not a trick, it's a system that quietly replaces the need for chemical correction entirely. If there's one thing I want you to take seriously, it's this: the health of your garden is not determined by how much you add, but by how much life you can sustain in the soil itself. Everything else is secondary. And if you decide to implement even a small version of this system, just one pipe, one worm bin, you'll start seeing changes that make most conventional gardening advice feel incomplete. If this resonated with you, subscribe and share the video so more serious growers can move away from surface-level gardening and towards systems that actually sustain themselves. And if you do pick up the VermiHut system, don't treat it as a gadget, treat it as the engine that powers everything we've talked about here, because when it's connected properly to your soil, it stops being a product and starts becoming part of your garden's biology. That's where real gardening begins.